Okay, that should stop the echo. Hi, everybody. Hi, Margot Shepard and Ken Brown, and Randy Hedgebeth and Rosemary Robertson. And Margot Shepard, hello to you all. How's my sound, everybody? Is it okay? Please let me know before I continue. As far as I know, it's fine, but it's always great to have some feedback from you before I really get into things. Joy Burgess Ramsey is joined. Hiya, Joy. How's my sound? Oh, thank you, Margot. That's what I was waiting to hear. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over Karen Garcia's article comparing the new plan for Social Security that Senator Warren just came out with the Bernie Sanders plan for the reform of Social Security. I think the article by Karen Garcia is a pretty good one. So let's get to that. It's not quite there for some reason yet. Let me make sure it gets there. There it is. You should be able to see me and the article right now. I'll make one more adjustment to make things easier. Title of the article is Warren's Social Security Reform is Not as Ambitious as Sanders. So Karen Garcia begins just in time for the third debate of the Democrats, actually, the third round of debates. In fossil fuel boomtown by USA in Houston, Texas, Senator Warren has unveiled a plan that would increase the monthly Social Security benefit by $200 for every recipient by asking the richest Americans to contribute their fair share to the program. Now, I'm going to say right off the bat, I know people who are getting $500 a month in Social Security. I know others who are getting $600 a month. I know people who are getting $650 a month. Uh, okay, if they get another 200, okay, it's nicer for them, but the water's still up to here on them, folks. The water's still up to here on them. Okay, the extra $200 a month is a lot better than the kick in the head. It's $2,400 per year, but it's not the kind of expansion to Social Security that really low Social Security income people actually need. I think what people need is a doubling of Social Security so that our public pensions are brought up to a European standard. Uh, then Karen Garcia continues, unlike the very similar bill reintroduced by Bernie Sanders earlier this year, Warren doesn't flat out suggest entirely scrapping the $132,900 cap on taxable earnings. But just like Bernie's plan, her sweeping, smart, and totally original, brand spanking new bold plan also calls for separate taxation of select investments to augment the payroll tax system. Okay, I've got a comment on that too. Uh, there are good reasons to tax the rich and good reasons to tax them very heavily. Those things have to do with inequality, okay, and actually lessening inequality. But of course, we all know that to pay for Social Security and increases to Social Security, we do not need to increase taxes at all. So, bills increasing Social Security stipends should be kept separate from bills that are going to increase taxation. Whichever group happens to be the group that is going to be taxed more dollars, that's a separate question. Okay. We should stop this muddying of the two. And we have to do the muddying both in Bernie's legislation and in Warren's legislation. They're both calling for taxation. Interestingly enough, Karen Garcia continues, Warren did not join with four other Democratic senators, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, but Jeff Merkley, and former contender Kirsten Gillibrand, in co-sponsoring Bernie's original Social Security expansion bill in 2017. Says Garcia. Evidently, she didn't co-sponsor that because she wanted to come out with her own plan, which is fine, but at least thus far as we read about it, this plan is somewhat underwhelming. But, says Karen, back to the gist of it all, as Bernie has been talking about for many decades, and as Warren has begun talking about as the 2020 horse race heats up, the very restrictive cap now in place means that the ultra-rich essentially finish paying off an entire year of Social Security taxes on January 1st, contributing exactly the same amount to the program as someone who earns $132,900 per year. Wealth is by no means taxed at the same rate as work. It's not even close. Before I go on with this, okay, I want to point out that yes, we all make Social Security contributions on our income. Uh, and those may be viewed as taxes. I have no problem with that. But I do have a problem with formulations that imply that those dollars actually end up somewhere, that they end up in a program, as opposed to simply being destroyed. They do not end up, okay, in any program. They end up in an accounting ledger kept by the Treasury Department and the Social Security Administration. And that accounting ledger shows how much is owed to the Social Security Trust Fund by the Treasury Department. However, we have to point out, okay, again, that the trust fund is not a bank account. It's not really a fund. It's just those dollars recorded in the ledger. That's all it is. It isn't really money. It's a record of what is owed to Social Security. It's the record of an internal debt that the Treasury Department has to the Social Security Administration. How much people get in Social Security each year is not actually determined by what's in the trust fund. That trust fund could fall to zero. All of the debts that are supposed to be owed to the trust fund, something like $3.8 trillion right now, I believe. Might be mistaken about that. I haven't been carefully tracking it. But if that amount were all paid back, in other words, if that ledger amount were extinguished, and the Treasury did so by paying out Social Security benefits that had been appropriated by Congress, the key point to always remember is that what gets paid out by Social Security is determined not by what's in the trust fund, but by what Congress decides to appropriate to pay out to Social Security recipients each year. So Karen finishes the paragraph, Karen Garcia, by saying, wealth is by no means taxed at the same rate as work. It is not even close. And she is quite right about that. So, put another way, Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates pay the exact same amount in Social Security taxes as a middle class single or two income couple living in a modest home in the suburbs. Yes, that's especially true when the suburb is where I live in Ashburn, Virginia. If oligarchic empires were subject to full progressive taxation, the nation's retirement program could conceivably flourish into perpetuity. Well, that is true, and it isn't true. The reason why it is true is because as long as Congress keeps appropriating the money and keeps on assessing the taxes, those payments are going to go out. But on the other hand, It isn't true because if Congress were to appropriate the money and order the Federal Reserve to mark up the Treasury spending account of the Treasury Department for the amount of payments that it has appropriated in a particular year, then the payments would also continue to go out, whether or not there had been any accompanying taxation. So I hope that all of you understand this. The determining factor in what actually gets paid out is whether the money has been appropriated and whether the Congress has made provisions for the Federal Reserve to top up the Treasury spending account so the Treasury can complete its mandate from Congress to pay out the benefits to people. So it depends on what Congress does and on the provisions that Congress has made. Under our present system, if Congress appropriates the money, then if the Treasury Department has to top up the Treasury spending account to make the payments, it can either wait for tax revenues to come in, or if it's running short at a particular time and tax revenues are lagging behind, then it can hold auctions selling Treasury securities with the aid of the Federal Reserve that actually holds the auctions. And the Treasury does the issuing of the securities. Okay, and then the Federal Reserve, acting according to its rules, will create new money in the Treasury spending account to match the amount of the sales, the security sales. So, Karen Garcia continues. Unlike Bernie's bill, whose progressive taxation of the wealth of the plutocrats would guarantee the solvency of the Social Security Fund for the next 50 years, Warren's more modest proposal would extend it for less than half of that span, or for 20 years. So why did Warren do that? Why did she put in a more modest proposal? It seems like there's a pattern here. Okay. The pattern is that Bernie comes out with a proposal and Warren comes out with a pretty good proposal of her own, but generally one that is more modest than Bernie's proposal. Almost always more modest when it comes to actually spending money than Bernie's programs are, and more modest when it comes to the benefits that are actually extended to people. Now, this is a pattern which previously existed between Bernie and Hillary Clinton in the 2015 and 16 run up to the primaries of 2016. And that is the pattern here. Now, Warren is more generous than Clinton was, and more adventurous, okay, than she was, and more likely to suggest something that might have been considered extremely progressive um, um, 4 years ago. But Warren seems to always be taking care to come in a bit behind where Bernie is in relation to her proposals. Could it possibly be because she's currying the favor of the moneyed interests and doesn't want to be seen as just as radical as Bernie Sanders? And Karen Garcia goes on. Therefore, her claim that she is proposing the quote biggest and most progressive increases in Social Security in nearly half a century unquote is a bit overblown. And not just because it copies the Sanders bill without actually crediting it. Her language is a lot less class conscious than his is. Instead of demanding that the wealthy pay more, she's politely asking them to, as though they actually have the choice to refuse. Her suggestions that the plutocrats contribute more is also far less than what ordinary people might consider a fair share. Yes, I think ordinary people would want to know, why is the income of the richer people in society, and particularly the plutocrats, why is the income at which they get taxed, why is it capped? Why is it capped at 132,900? Why is there a cap at all? Why do we need a cap? Why do they need a cap? Her suggestion that the plutocrats can contribute more is also far less than what ordinary people might consider a fair share. This is especially true since this requested allegedly fair share serves to protect the long term interests and the rattled psychic security of the rich. Well put, I think. In this age of rising civil discontent, her tax reforms to benefit of the regular people are really no skin off rich financial noses at all. Best of all, the convoluted tax figures which she puts forth, unlike a true permanent scrapping of the cap, would be very much subject to backroom tinkering and bipartisan sausage making and horse trading with maximum input from the minimally affected donor class and their teams of hungry lobbyists. The poor, of course, have no lobby. Again, I think that passage is very well put. In our own much more liberal way, Warren echoes the mantra of her former boss, Barack Obama, uttered reassuringly to the Wall Street bankers who ruined the economy. She is the latest thing standing between the squeamish, tax averse, wealthy, and what Obama designated as, quote, as the, quote, pitchforks, unquote. Oh, and she also wants to seduce older Joe Biden fans into her camp as she brings up his own myriad disgusting efforts to cut Social Security, which efforts would probably continue to come if he was selected as the nominee. I add that to the article. That's not in her article. So Karen Garcia continues, it is interesting to note, meanwhile, that even as she claims to support Bernie's Medicare for All legislation, without yet putting forth her own original detailed plan, one of Warren's rationales for modestly increasing monthly retirement benefits is to help struggling seniors meet their rising medical and drug costs. She writes in the Medium post that she put forward. In 2019, the average Social Security beneficiary received $1,354 a month, or $16,248 a year. For someone who worked their entire adult life at an average wage and retired this year at the age of 66, Social Security will replace just 41% of what they used to make. That's well short of the 70% many financial advisors actually recommend for a decent retirement. One that allows you to keep living in your home, go to a doctor when you're sick, and get the prescription drugs you need. Okay. Now, that is true, but what she fails to mention is that in other civilized nations, as again, okay, in Europe, the public pensions do meet the 70% and sometimes exceed the 70% standard that the financial advisors actually recommend. So they can afford it over in Europe, but we can't afford it here. Sure, we can't afford it here. She makes it a point to sell her plan as a stopgap measure just in case we don't adopt Medicare for all. Karen says this is a wink and a nod to the neoliberal Clinton operatives she's reportedly canoodling with these days. And just to emphasize, Sanders' Medicare for All bill would abolish the 20% copays that are financially breaking so many struggling older people covered under the regular Medicare Act. Yes, they are breaking financially many struggling older people. And in pointing out that Congress hasn't increased Social Security benefits in 50 years, her suggested $200 a month increase adjusted for inflation and the rising cost of living is actually a pittance. To her credit, she does call for revising cost of living calculations to ensure that monthly benefits keep pace with the costs of barely staying alive. That is good, by the way, because other than Bernie Sanders, there's no one else proposing that. Karen Garcia goes on to say, it's certainly a lot better than Barack Obama's failed attempt to reduce benefits through a chained CPI formula. That, by the way, was grotesque. Obama was grotesque in the austerity he tried to impose on people getting benefits. Obama was such a failure, such a disappointment. So don't get me wrong, there's plenty to like in Warren's plan, says Karen Garcia, not least of which is in the inclusion of unpaid stay at home uh, mothers and other caregivers in the earnings tables, thus boosting their future Social Security benefits. But here's the catch. There's always a catch, says Garcia. Quote, my plan will give credit towards the Social Security average lifetime earnings calculation to people who provide 80 hours a month of unpaid care to a child under the age of 6, a dependent with a disability, including a veteran family member or an elderly relative, For every month of caregiving that meets these requirements, the caregiver will be credited for Social Security purposes with a month of income equal to the monthly average of that year's median annual wage. People can receive an unlimited amount of caregiving credits and can claim these credits um, in a retroactive manner if they've done this kind of caregiving work in the last 5 years. By giving caregivers credits equal to the median wage that year, this credit will provide a particular boost in benefits to the lower income workers. And Karen Garcia then says, given that caring full time for a newborn, a toddler, a preschooler, or a sick, or elderly relative means being on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This reimbursement formula seems far from generous or fair. It's giving part time status to a full time job whose median wage includes mandatory unpaid double overtime. I might add here that as part of Bernie's Green New Deal plan, he has a job guarantee bill. And local communities under the job guarantee bill would be able to declare a full time caregiving as a job that would be paid a living wage by the federal government, just like any other job in the job guarantee program. It would be considered a full time job. So, that particular benefit alone, while not given under the heading of Social Security, would be a much better deal than what Warren is actually proposing here. And the caregivers involved would also be provided with Social Security benefits in the same way that other workers are. So they'd be taking care of their newborn, their toddler, their preschoolers, or their relatives, getting paid for it, and getting Social Security credits for it. Now that's a real benefit plan. That's one to conjure with. Okay. Now Garcia isn't pointing to this in this article, but I am, because we have to compare Bernie's plans for people, not just the Social Security part, but parts of other legislation he's proposing where they intersect or cross over with the problem area that Warren is trying to address here. In other words, Bernie's legislative program addresses that particular problem in a better way, and a way that is much more generous for the people putting in the time. Because they're not only getting Social Security credits, but they're getting paid, as well. So Karen Garcia goes on. Say you're a single mother in her 40s, 50s, or 60s who struggled financially 10 or 20 or 30 years ago and has a spotty paid work history and no retirement savings as a result. Now you're out of luck under Warren's plan. You would have had to squeeze all that approved caregiving into the last 5 years to qualify for better retirement benefits. And even if you had, you'd still have to jump through all kinds of bureaucratic hoops in order to qualify for credits. What busy parent or caregiver has ever bothered to keep a written record of his or her hours? Now, that could be fixed by imputing work to people who are mothers or who are caregivers in the home. But that's not in Warren's bill. Given that we're increasingly becoming a jobless society in a gig economy, quote unquote, wouldn't it make more sense to phase out the traditional work requirements of Social Security altogether? And no, Social Security should never be replaced with the universal basic income proposals so beloved of the technocrats and billionaires like Elon Musk. For starters, the UBI would eliminate all other programs serving the vulnerable, the old, the young, the sick, and the disabled. It would effectively be a highly regressive scheme with the poor essentially subsidizing the middle classes and the affluent because those in need would get less than they do now, even under the meager assistance programs like SNAP, the food stamp programs. Yes, Karen Garcia is quite right about that. Chunks of Warren's own technocratic Social Security reform package seem unnecessarily stingy, not to mention confusing and complicated, especially when they're coupled with her worthy suggestions to give full widow's benefits to prematurely retired disabled women and to restore a deceased parent's survivor benefits to full-time students up to age 22. Under Ronald Reagan, survivor benefits were cut off when the beneficiary reached 18 or graduated high school. Now, why do you suppose that there are some things in Warren's package that seem unnecessarily stingy? Why do you suppose that's the case? I think it's because Warren believes that what the federal government can spend is determined only by what it can tax and what it can borrow. She doesn't spend much time looking at Section 8 of the Constitution and the idea that the Congress can create whatever money it chooses to create in order to provide for the general welfare. Warren doesn't really look at that. She doesn't really look at the possibility of the Congress appropriating money and asking the Federal Reserve to top up the Treasury spending account for the amount of the appropriation upon the passage of each appropriation bill or each CR bill or any other kind, of money bill passed by Congress. Warren doesn't see that. She hasn't really learned that. And that's a difference between Warren and Bernie Sanders. Now Bernie may still go around telling people that he's going to pay for this and that he's going to pay for that and he's going to pay for the other thing by taxing the rich. And he may even say how he's going to do it by taxing the rich. But we know that Bernie knows that he doesn't have to tax the rich to pay for the benefits that he is proposing, that they can be paid for by congressional fiat if he has a friendly Congress. Or failing that, they can be paid for his issuing a very high value platinum coin, such as, for example, $100 trillion platinum coin, and depositing it in the Mint's account at the Fed, which then can be swept into the Treasury spending account at will by the Secretary of the Treasury. Karen Garcia goes on. Bernie demands that avaricious billionaires pay more, and he welcomes their hatred. Warren not only politely asks them to contribute a fair share, she consistently refers to the wealthy as families, thus gifting them with qualities of nurturing and humanity that many of them don't even remotely possess. She lumps professionals making a tad more than 250,000 in with criminal oligarchs who've looted billions from the body politic. This effectively removes the onus from the oligarchs, besides perhaps alienating a few of the wealthy elites currently rooting for her, while attracting less well off Biden supporters who might be convinced to root for her with the dream of an extra $200 a month wafting through their heads. Somehow, I don't think that metaphor quite mixes, but I get the point. Yeah. Her new suggested FICA tax rate of 14 odd percent on the entire top 2%, split with one's employer, certainly seems meager compared to the 90% rate imposed on the highest earnings in the Eisenhower years. Well, to be clear here, okay, the 90% tax rate was imposed on the highest earnings in the Eisenhower years and in the years before that, in the Roosevelt years and the Truman years. And even for a little while, if I recall correctly, in the Hoover years, or it was very close to that as well. But the point being, in the 1950s, in the Eisenhower years, there were all kinds of loopholes in the tax system. So very few, if any, of the super rich of that time actually paid the 90% rate on their earnings. So the 90% rate was something of a fiction, something of a paper rate. Going on, a self described, quote, capitalist to my bones, Warren is loath to directly address the class war, loath to demonize the obscenely rich, loath to directly call them out by name. I think she's making a distinction here between the obscenely rich and the corporations that crash the economy and the banks and the Wall Street gamblers that we know she does not like and that she calls out all the time. But she doesn't call out the Bill Gates of the world and the Jeff Bezos of the world. And the other extremely rich people, she leaves that to Bernie Sanders. Going on. There's just enough wealth redistribution in Warren's plan to make the neoliberal thought a collective pretend to howl with outrage at the mere prospect of being parted with even a modest percentage of their wealth. They might even have to fire one of their maids or forego purchase of their third luxury car next year. Their third luxury car. I mean, the really rich, don't they have like 10 luxury cars? But don't they usually have garages full of luxury cars they collect? Bernie is much more to the point. He cuts right to the chase, and he names names, and he unabashedly evokes the public indignation so absolutely necessary if we are ever to truly change the system rather than simply tweak it around the edges. So I gave you a running commentary on this article. I'd conclude by saying that Warren's plan is clearly inferior to Bernie's from the point of view of how it actually taxes the rich, which we may want to do to lessen the high degree of inequality we have in our system. But it's also true that her expansion of Social Security is nowhere near as generous, as Bernie's expansion of Social Security, nor in the present terms of Social Security legislation does it create as solid a foundation for Social Security as the Bernie plan actually does. In saying this, though, we again have to recognize that the only really solid foundation for any Social Security plan is Congress is willing to continue to appropriate the money for Social Security year after year after year. That is the only real security. And the only way we're going to get that kind of security is to create a real democracy here with an active populace that constantly monitors our politicians 365 days a year through continuous lobbying by bottom up voting blocks and coalitions that communicate with congressional representatives and with senators on a day to day basis, exactly like the lobbyists do. That's the only real safety for our Social Security programs. The only real safety for democratic socialism, or for that matter, for democracy, is continual bottom up emergence of new power from the citizenry, countering the tendencies of the iron law, okay, of oligarchy to ossify any power structure that may exist either now or uh, uh, in the future. So I think we have to keep that in mind. And the other thing that we ought to keep in mind is that the person who is running now, who is most likely to help us to actually really deliver the goods to people that we all need, the psychic goods, the material goods, the benefit, and the power to bottom up democracy that we need. The only person to create a favorable environment for that, who is running right now, uh, 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 is Bernie Sanders. So, I will now entertain your comments and questions. Let me go back to Facebook. Well, let me go back to just me. And then let me go back to Facebook and see what you have to say. Joy Burgess Ramsey says, "Hello, Dr. Firestone. I'm listening to the climate video, a very important issue today." Which one of the climate videos, Joy? And Bonnie says, "Hi, everyone." Devore has joined, and Russell Gorman has joined. Catherine Class has joined. Hi, Catherine. How are you? And Catherine says, "Wow, $134 but for Medicare Part B." And she says, "As the currency issuer, the federal government can afford it." It certainly can, Catherine. Catherine asks, "Where were all these ideas in 2016? They were behind closed doors." Catherine says, "I wouldn't be at home if my husband wasn't retired." And William Pitt has joined. Uh, if it's the same one, then William Pitt is the editor in chief, okay, of Truthout. And remember, this very article was published in Truthout. And William Pitt is one hell of an editor and writer. And Roseanne Hilke, I think it is, has joined. Margot Shepard says, "Suddenly we were watching Bernie on housing. Then you came back on Social Security. I saw Bernie on housing earlier tonight. I thought he was great on housing." Catherine says, "Great job." Thank you, Catherine. And she says, "I am fine." And Rob has joined. And Rob says, "Hey, Yoda." Hey, Rob. Okay, any more comments? Any questions I can answer? Are there any more diatribes I can give this evening? I'm in a mood of having these. The debates uh, got me extremely angry. Extremely angry. I really leaped out of my chair when they spent only 5 minutes on the Green New Deal. What a bunch! What a bunch of plutocrats at ABC. I mean, they have a death cult over there. And Rob Rivera says SSDI should either get 1,000 or you get um, uh, SSDI. And Russ says, why did the debates get you angry? They got me angry because the moderators but selected the questions and selected who the people were who were going to answer the questions. And they provided, yes, also MSNBC did the same thing. I was very angry, okay, at MSNBC too. Very, very angry at them at the time. But after the climate forum last week and how well that went, comparatively speaking, for ABC to do something that just paled in comparison to that climate forum in terms of being informative about how people were feeling about this. It was ridiculous. It was a regression. It was a regression. It just underlined how corrupt the media is. The day after, I was so angry that I was about to propose that what Bernie should do at this point is to get together with Tulsi and whoever else he can get aboard and but come together and say they were withdrawing from the DNC and major media debates and would no longer participate in them, and that they were going to hold their own debates. I understand the party would probably hit back by disqualifying Bernie and also Tulsi as candidates for the nomination for the presidency. But I was that angry at the way the DNC and the MSM were rigging these debates. And Rob talked about Bernie's campaign staff should have told Bernie he needs to rest his voice, in my opinion, from an optics perspective. Rob, I think that optics are not everything. I think that courage counts for something too. So here's Bernie. He goes on there and debates with an obvious problem from the standpoint of the hoarseness, okay, of his voice. But he hangs in there. He hangs in there for the whole debate. He gets better as time goes on. He comes out actually doing very well. He comes out as one of the winners of the debate by common opinion. Not the only winner. Also, Warren was. But Bernie performed well. Then he goes to the spin room. Then he does a series, okay, of interviews. Then he flies to Nevada and he does a series of events today in Nevada using that voice, fighting for what he believes and for what he wants for us. He goes right on with his campaign. He doesn't allow the hoarse voice to stop him. He drives home the point. Who else in this campaign would do that except for myself? That's the implication. The implication is that's what Bernie, okay, is saying to us. He's saying that I don't care about the optics. What counts is what I'm willing to do for you, the people of the United States. That's what he's saying. That's what he's demonstrating by his behavior. That's important. So Rob says we need less regulation and government be allowing the market to do or charge what the market can bear. If prices go up, let it be, they need to go up. Well, there's Rob. He's kidding again. Every once in a while, he goes on these right wing tirades. Rob says the MSM isn't rigging anything. You just don't like the way they operate. That's market forces and the invisible hand of the market at work in real time. What market? What market, Rob? It's totally rigged. And Catherine says, Bernie works hard and gets sympathy, which is well deserved. It's not the sympathy he wants. It's not the sympathy he's trying to get. What he's trying to get is our commitment, our willingness to work as hard as he works. And Rob says, I saw the Carson City Town Hall. I thought it was a wonderful event. I guess a Trump supporter was asking about Medicare, and they had a really pleasant exchange. Bernie knows how to win over voters. He does. He respects voters in the way they ought to be respected. Catherine Class says the MSM lies. Yes, they do. And Rob says, I love playing devil's advocate. I think you love playing the devil. I don't know if you're doing much advocating. Then the mainstream media isn't lying. They're just not explaining everything because they say they must have forgotten or they just don't know. Or they also sometimes say it's God's will. It's not us, it's God's will. And Catherine says, I understand, but as a loyal follower, I feel for him. I feel for him too, but I'm also proud of him. Very, very proud of him. I think I know where Bernie comes from. I think I understand. Rob Rob says the MSM is just the marketplace of ideas. Rob, I think that was the laugh line of the night. The last time it was a marketplace of ideas was in the 19th century. Rob says, I like very Bernie. I just want him to win. Yeah, you and the rest of us, I think, all want him to win. Catherine Class says, I think you understand better than most. Uh, well, Catherine, my family wasn't as poor, okay, as Bernie's. And my father had a small business, okay, for a very long time. We didn't have a 3.5 room apartment in New York. We had a 5 room apartment, okay, in New York. But we lived in an apartment. And we did not have a car. And I rode the subways as a kid. And my father worked during the busy season. He had a dry cleaning business. Okay, and but during the busy season, he would work for 18 hours a day for weeks on end. I still don't know how he did it. I mean, just amazing. And my mother went to work in the same business, okay, when I was 8. And she worked hard too. Okay, and my family made a living, and they gave me, okay, a lot of advantage, but they worked very very hard for it, and I understand what it is to work hard as well. Hi, Larry Elger. How are you? Nice to see you, Larry. Rob says, I love Bernie very much. I just want him to win. Yeah. And Rob asked me if I think that Bernie is really a socialist or a social democrat. Doesn't matter either way because he's got an MMT economic team in back of him. I don't know. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish between a democratic socialist and a social democrat. I know people make the distinctions, but when you get to the concrete programs that Bernie, okay, is advocating for right now, those are social democratic programs. Now, once he becomes the president of the United States, and we go through 2 terms, then we may see Bernie go beyond social democracy to some of the really creative aspects of 21st century socialism. But it remains to be seen whether that, okay, is going to happen. But whether he's just a social democrat inside as opposed to a socialist, okay, I don't know. I think his way of handling the label socialist has been very, very clever. I think he took on the label early because he knew people were going to call him a socialist anyway. So he embraced the name socialist early. And whenever people asked him about it, he would tell them, okay, this is what I think it means to be a socialist. And then he would outline basically what were New Deal policies. And he would implicitly, okay, or explicitly ask people whether they too were for those policies. And that's the way he handled it. Okay, the Democrats of that time, and earlier than that, starting back in the 1970s, would simply dodge the label and say, "No, I'm no socialist," and argue against the idea that they were socialists. They would do the kind of thing that Warren, is doing now. Oh no, I'm a capitalist to my bones. Okay. I'm not a socialist. But I believe in a mixed economy. I believe in private property. Bernie was the only one who said, I'm a socialist, and this is what it means to me. I'm running on this. Now do me something. If you don't like it, then do me something. This is what I'm running on. And he won, and he won, and he won again, and he won again, and he won again, and he ran for the Senate, and he won again, and he won again, and he's been winning all these years while he's been telling people he's a socialist. And he's never gotten any more socialistic in his programs than were getting advocated by people like John Kenneth Galbraith during the New Deal period, during the Second World War, and in the later years. He's never advocated anything more left than that. Okay, so is he a socialist? I don't know. But he's telling us he is. So my daughter warns me that I'm bending over again and that I have to sit up straight. I have a terrible habit of bending over. And the reason why I am is because I need to see the screen up closer. Only now I don't need to be closer to the screen because I now have a nice new monitor over to my right, and the type is much larger on that monitor, and I can read that easily even when I'm sitting up straight. So my daughter correctly points out, I can hardly see your sleeves anymore, you're bending over. So I'm trying to break that very bad habit so you can see my face more easily. Not more evilly, more easily. Steve Gonzo has arrived. Okay, and Rob says, I just saw a video from Warren. Steve Gonzo joined, and Rob says, I just finally finished reading Listen Liberal by Thomas Frank. As I was reading it, I had to stop because of how angry I would get at how terrible the Democratic Party looks at regular people and how they embraced the quote knowledge class, highly educated people from prestigious universities. Okay, Rob, I have to admit I'm a member of the knowledge class. And for that matter, Bernie Sanders is too. He's a member of the knowledge class. He's highly educated. And he came from the University of Chicago, which is a highly prestigious school. I graduated from Cornell. I got my PhD, okay, at Michigan State. Cornell University is certainly a very high prestige school. But not all of us have forgotten our roots. Rob says, Warren is from the knowledge class. She is from the knowledge class, but before she was from the knowledge class, she was from, I believe, the rural middle class, and from a family that was down on its luck after her father had a heart attack, and things got financially rough for her family. So she has a reason to be more economically progressive than she really seems to be. Catherine asks, providing for the general welfare, is it really so? Catherine Class says, socialism. So I guess that's Catherine's view, okay, of socialism. And maybe, okay, it's Bernie's view, okay, as well. Rob says, I just saw a video from Warren in 2012 when she was asked if she was in favor of single payer, and in a smug way just scoffed at it. And also responded with, have you seen my record? I don't trust her. Yeah, I don't trust her either. And Rob says, correction, I mean, Warren is not in favor. Yep, she may not be in favor of that. Okay, thanks for all the discussion. Oh, by the way, have people shared yet? Please share, like, and subscribe. I'm going to show you my share, like, and subscribe screen now. And please become a patron at www.patreon.com. Joe underscore Firestone. And I want to say how grateful I am to those who have become the patrons. Thank you very, very much. It is very good for me to have patrons and to keep the lights on. It isn't always so easy to do that. So, there's a little delay, so I'm back now. There's a little there's a little bit of a delay after I take off the Patreon screen, the share, like, and subscribe screen, and come back to Facebook. And Rob says, I'm not saying everyone is bad that come from those universities, but there is a lot who look down on the rest of us who didn't attend these universities. Their reasoning why they look down on us think we didn't work hard enough. Yeah, we didn't work hard enough. And it's that's your fault. Well, I mean, that doesn't make you less than they. Last time I looked at what we're supposed to be, not what we are, we were supposed to be a democracy. And everybody does what they can do. In an educational situation, people often do the best they can do. I've had experience, by the way, so does Warren. She's had experience in teaching at the state universities and good schools, but not so elite schools. And there are many regular people there, who did not go to Harvard. And when you teach these students, you learn quickly that they're very bright and that there are many of them who work very hard, and that there are many of them who are very successful. And they have that spark in them when it comes to learning. And we have to respect that spark. And Margot says, great talk as usual. Thanks, Joe. Thank you, Margot, for coming, as you always do. And Rob says, I got to make you an advertising picture. Catherine says, thanks a lot. Thank you for coming. Catherine. Margot says, great talk as usual. Thanks, Joe. Margot says, thanks for the laughs. Rob. And Rob says, you bet. Yeah, Rob's always happy to oblige when it comes to the laughs. So, I've been on now for about an hour and a half. So, I think, unless you've got something really pregnant at this point, that's going to be the in-depth show for tonight. As I see Bonnie groaning, and my screen has now frozen for the nth time, as well. So thanks very much for coming. I gave you the gospel, I think, on comparing Warren and Sanders. Have a great evening and a great weekend. And I'll be back on Monday night. So thanks for coming. I'll see you then. Bye.